Hey guys, tonight we open a door no one wants to knock on. You're barefoot on stone. Your shift clings to you, damp with sweat. A wooden latch creaks behind you. Not locking, not unlocking, just thinking about it. Somewhere down the corridor, a torch sputters. The footsteps are closer now. You don't know the man coming. Or maybe you do. Doesn't matter. This is how it starts, with silence, ritual, and an audience that may be listening behind the wall. If this sleepy scroll through the past brought you peace, a like and a sub would mean a lot. Post your location and the local time in the comments. I always read them. How are you doing tonight? Now, sink into the dark corridors of the medieval bedroom, where sex wasn't just private, it was policy. You are a peasant girl, maybe 15, maybe younger, maybe not even that lucky. Marriage means survival, not love. You've been promised to a man twice your age because he owns 2 goats and a quarter-acre near the river. The church blessed it. Your father arranged it. Your mother gave you a look that meant, don't fight. Just close your eyes. Medieval marriage wasn't always about romance. It was a legal alliance, and your body was often a treaty. Canon law required consent, in theory. But consent is a generous word when you've never had a choice. If you're noble, the arrangement comes with a dowry and cold ceremony. If you're a serf, it comes with that knock at the door. Here's the first rule you learn fast. Sex isn't private in this world. It's a social checkpoint, something to be witnessed, sometimes even celebrated, if you're noble. In some parts of Europe, post-wedding traditions included the bedding ceremony, where family and neighbors led you both to bed, gave loud advice, and yes, sometimes stayed in the room. A bishop might even offer a prayer over your trembling forms. No pressure. Other nights were worse. Sometimes when you weren't married yet, sex still came to your door. The local lord might claim droit du seigneur, or first night rights. Historians still argue whether this practice actually existed, or if it was just a nasty rumor to explain away trauma. But it haunted enough medieval minds to feel real. Peasants whispered about it. Jokes and plays assumed it. The power imbalance was real enough, even if the custom wasn't written in stone. Sometimes you're not the peasant girl. You're the peasant boy, still no safer, especially if you're alone, or different, or unlucky. Male servants in noble households were often expected to serve in every sense. Your silence was survival. Your body, just another payment. The legal age of consent? Also up for debate, church law technically set it at 12 for girls, 14 for boys. That's when you could marry. That's also when many stopped being children in the eyes of the law and started being bodies for use. Again, the lines blur. Consent laws were written by men in robes who took vows of celibacy and then secretly fathered children behind cathedral walls. Looking at you, Bishop of Winchester. But let's not paint this era with one brush. Across Europe, sex and marriage customs varied wildly. In Scandinavia, couples might test their compatibility first. Yes, they invented the original try before you buy. In certain alpine villages, parents even built separate huts where young women could entertain suitors before deciding on a husband. It wasn't utopia, but it beat a chamber full of priests chanting over your first kiss. Still, most of the time, fear came first, then formality, then silence. You did not speak of pleasure. You did not expect it. You did not learn about your own body unless another hand taught you or took from you. This is where the night air tightens. You hear his breath behind the door. If you're lucky, he's kind. If you're less lucky, he's nervous and rough and afraid of your body like it's a beast to conquer. And he thinks that's what he's supposed to do, because nobody ever told him different. And this brings us to one of the weirdest details of all. Many couples in the Middle Ages were never told how sex worked. Not really. Priests didn't explain. Mothers whispered fragments. fathers said nothing. Some genuinely thought babies came from belly kisses or sleeping too close. That's why certain church courts spent precious parchment describing, with clinical despair, what parts should go where, which leads to some misunderstandings. One 14th century case describes a couple suing for annulment because after 2 years of marriage, the bride was still a virgin. Why? Because her husband was trying to conceive by rubbing her stomach. No, seriously. The judge ordered a midwife to demonstrate the basics. It's almost funny. Almost. Until you remember these were lives, trapped by ignorance, doctrine, and desperation. You weren't educated unless you were male, rich, and preferably in line for a bishopric. You weren't given words for your own experience. You weren't even told that your feelings, attraction, revulsion, confusion, were normal. If anything, they were sins to confess. And then there's the gossip. Villages were thick with ears. You sneeze too loud and someone assumes you're pregnant. You spend too long at the well with the Thatcher's daughter? Whispers. You laugh too hard at a man's joke in church? Accusations. You bleed strangely one month? Someone brings garlic and holy water to your door. Your sexuality is not yours. It's the village's. It belongs to the priest, the midwife, the neighbor who watches from her window. It belongs to the man with goats and land. It belongs to the church calendar, which will soon tell you when to abstain, and for how many days. But we're not there yet. Tonight, you wait behind that door. Your heart thuds like a muffled drum. You try to remember your mother's advice. Don't speak. Don't cry. Just pray he's not cruel. The footsteps stop. The latch lifts. And history holds its breath. The crowd outside your door isn't leaving. Not yet. They're holding candles. Some are laughing. Others are whispering. One uncle has clearly had too much mead and keeps nudging people like it's a festival. It kind of is. You're about to be put to bed. And not just figuratively. In the medieval world, especially among nobles and well-off commoners, your wedding night wasn't considered official until the bedding ceremony was complete. That meant not just vows, not just a kiss, but witnessed consummation, or at least the part right before it. So now you walk slowly toward the bed, hand in hand with your brand new spouse, both of you red-faced and terrified. The sheets are fresh. The fire crackles in the hearth. And behind you trail a small parade of relatives, clergy, and enthusiastic onlookers. Why? Because marriage was a legal contract, and contracts needed proof. You couldn't just say you were married. You had to show it. That meant the bedding ritual, a bizarre mashup of public spectacle and private awkwardness. Sometimes the crowd stayed only long enough to see you both climb into bed. Other times they lingered, sang songs, told crude jokes. Occasionally, they helped undress you. Yes, that was a thing. In parts of Germany and France, it wasn't uncommon for a couple to be stripped down by their wedding guests, like some kind of slow-motion human unboxing event. And if you were royalty? Multiply the awkwardness by 100. Kings and queens had to prove heirs were on the way. That meant political witnesses. Chronicles describe noble brides being paraded to bed, kissed goodbye by their new in-laws, and tucked in like ceremonial dolls. Some historians say that guests actually remained in the room, peeking from curtains or screens until the couple got started. Others argue they waited nearby, listening for sounds that indicated all was proceeding. It's debated, of course. Historians still argue whether certain customs were symbolic or literal. But even symbolic intrusion was bad enough. What happens next? Well, in some regions, after the deed, or what everyone assumed was the deed, the couple would produce a sheet. Not just any sheet, but the sheet. One with blood on it, hopefully. The proof of virginity. Here's where biology and folklore had a really messy breakup. Not all women bleed during first intercourse. Not even most. But if you didn't, people noticed. In some villages, A bloodless sheet was enough to question the marriage, or worse, accuse the bride of premarital relations, or even adultery. And we'll get to what that meant later. Spoiler, nothing good. Think fire, or ropes. In some cases, mothers-in-law or midwives were brought in to examine the bride beforehand, or after. Yes, inspections, with fingers, with judgment. And if blood was needed and didn't show up naturally, there were ways to fake it. Poking a finger, hiding a chicken liver. One Italian folk recipe even recommended a tiny sachet of pig's blood hidden in the folds of your gown. Because if you failed this test, the marriage could be annulled, your dowry revoked, your reputation ruined, and your husband free to go find a more honest wife. But this wasn't just about blood. It was about control. Society obsessed over virginity because it was the only way, they thought, to ensure paternity. If a man wanted to be sure his children were his, he needed to be the first and only to enter that particular metaphorical castle. Hence the anxiety. Hence the sheets. Not that men were held to the same standards, of course. A groom could arrive drunk, inexperienced, or completely clueless, and no one questioned his honor. In fact, if he fumbled, he might be pitied. Given advice, even potions. And here's a fringe tidbit you'll love. In 15th century France, if a marriage was contested due to non-consummation, the man might be asked to prove his abilities. How? With a virility test in front of a panel. One unfortunate fellow had to try and perform with a prostitute while noblemen peered from behind a curtain. It did not go well. Meanwhile, for women, failure to bleed wasn't just disappointing. It was damning. Some were returned to their families in disgrace. Others were quietly passed off to convents, labeled defective. A few stood trial for fraud. Yes, fraud, accused of pretending to be virgins to secure a better marriage. Even worse, you could be forced to prove you hadn't had sex. Virginity exams administered by experts. The logic was flimsy, the trauma real. And of course, if the new bride did bleed, celebrations all around, songs, laughter, maybe a little wine. Sometimes the sheet was paraded outside like a flag of victory. Imagine being the person who had to launder that. Now, here's the curveball. Not everyone hated these rituals. In some regions, the bedding ceremony was seen as bonding, communal, even comforting. Friends might sing blessings. The bride's sisters might whisper advice. For isolated couples, it was the only time society acknowledged that intimacy was both natural and necessary. But more often, it was surveillance dressed as celebration. You were being watched, judged. Your private moment turned into public theater. Even if the curtains were drawn, you could feel the breath of tradition on your skin, the expectations pressing in like the weight of wool blankets. And in your ears, the old rhymes. A silent bride is a blessed one. A moan is a prayer half spoken. No blood, no bond. You clutch the blanket tighter. In the dark, you realize the scariest part isn't that people are watching. It's that they think they have the right to. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't just between two people. It was between two families, two estates, two worldviews. You weren't in bed alone. You brought the village with you. And once morning comes, that village expects results. Babies, proof, compliance. The fire crackles, the candle sputters. And outside the door, someone chuckles and says, "Give 'em till sunrise." You wake up sore. Not just physically, though yes, that too, but in the way that seeps into your ribs and behind your eyes, a kind of soreness that feels more like subtraction than injury, like something quiet has been taken from you. And just when you think the hardest part is over, you realize, now come the rules. So many rules, on paper, in sermons, scribbled into the margins of prayer books and sing guides. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't just expected, it was regulated. Thoroughly, relentlessly, often absurdly. The church had opinions, and boy did it make sure you knew them. Let's start with the calendar. Imagine waking up beside your spouse and realizing, uh-oh, it's Friday. No sex today. Also not on Wednesday, or Sunday, or during Lent, or Advent, or the eve of a saint's feast, or any day when you've had impure thoughts, eaten too much garlic, or are too close to a holy relic. Some estimates say over a third of the year was considered off limits for marital relations. One 12th century English penitential text casually reminded believers that sex during prohibited days was a sin punishable by weeks of fasting, or worse, eternal damnation. So yeah, date night's a no-go. And let's talk position. Oh yes, the church got very involved. Missionary? Approved. Barely. Anything else? Heresy. Certain theologians, looking at you, Thomas Aquinas, warned that anything too passionate, too inventive, or heaven forbid pleasurable, risked inviting demons into your marriage bed. That's not a metaphor. Some preachers claimed that angels turned away in shame if you got too enthusiastic. Others insisted that demons watched, eager to claim your soul mid-moan. There were even reports of monks writing grim warnings about beastly behaviors, usually while struggling very hard not to describe them in too much detail. They usually failed. Here's a classic quote from a 13th century cleric. "It is better to sow seed in the earth than in a mouth, for one leads to harvest and the other to rot." Yes, that was supposed to be a metaphor. Yes, it's terrible. But what about sex within marriage? Surely that was safe. Well, define safe. You see, even married couples were warned constantly that too much sex was dangerous, spiritually dangerous. If you enjoyed it too much, that was lust. If you wanted it too often, that was gluttony of the flesh. And if you weren't trying to make a baby, why even bother? Sex was tolerated as a necessary evil, a functional duty, not a source of joy. If you couldn't abstain, fine, but you were supposed to feel bad about it. Really bad. Like whip yourself in a monastery bad. Which leads us to the next bizarre fact. In some communities, married couples needed permission to resume intimacy after childbirth. A church permit for sex. Called churching, it was a purification rite for new mothers. Until then, you were considered unclean, and your bedroom off limits. So yes, sex required scheduling, and guilt, and paperwork. And yet, people still tried to find loopholes. Take the sin manuals, little booklets used by confessors to tally up what sins you'd committed and how many Our Fathers you'd need to fix it. These manuals are stuffed with oddly specific scenarios, like, if a man lies with his wife on a feast day, penance is 10 days of fasting. If he lies with her in the wrong position, 20 days. If he does it out of sheer lust, 40 days. If he thinks of another woman while doing it, double penance. So, good luck. It was like a spiritual tax code, but with more candles and fewer deductions. And here's a weird little fringe tidbit. In certain towns, confessors kept tally sheets, not with names, but with sins marked by symbol. A local priest in Bohemia even carved them into wooden beads for quicker tracking. Imagine going to confession and seeing your shame laid out like a medieval bingo card. Of course, not all rules were enforced equally. If you were a nobleman, you could break the rules, as long as you donated to the church, or funded a stained glass window, or built a new wing on the monastery. Forgiveness was surprisingly flexible if you came with a purse full of gold and a well-practiced apology. But if you were poor, or a woman, or queer, that was different. Especially for women, whose sexuality was treated like a loaded crossbow. Dangerous, potentially sinful, definitely not to be trusted. You were expected to be passive, quiet, receptive. If you enjoyed sex too much, some texts warned your womb might wander around your body seeking satisfaction. Yes, wandering womb syndrome. Very real, very fake. Which brings us to one of the strangest church-sanctioned opinions of all, that sex was holiest when done with a heavy heart. One abbot wrote, "The ideal union is that which occurs in darkness, with neither joy nor voice, but with solemnity and restraint." So romantic. This philosophy, that pleasure was suspect, infected everything, even art. Medieval images of Adam and Eve show them looking deeply ashamed even before the apple. Nude figures were rare. When they did appear, it was usually as a warning, not a celebration. And music? Secular love songs existed, but church officials often frowned on them. One bishop banned lute playing in bedrooms entirely, claiming it incited ungodly rhythms. God forbid a good beat. But despite all this, the fear, the guilt, the constant threat of hellfire, people still wanted each other. They snuck into barns, whispered behind market stalls, brushed hands under cloaks during winter processions. There's a reason so many medieval records are full of scandal. Desire doesn't wait for permission. It just finds cracks to slip through. And every time the church tried to clamp down, someone found a new way to rebel. That's the tension you live with now. You've been told how, when, and why to be intimate. You've been warned, charted, sermonized. And yet, one look, one touch, one midnight meeting, and it all unravels. Not because you're wicked, but because you're human. Just don't let the priest find out. You wake to whispers outside the door, then footsteps, then silence. You already know what they want, or rather, what they want proof of. There's a servant with a bundle in her arms. She doesn't speak, just walks in, lifts the sheet, folds it carefully. Her eyes flick toward the center. Red. Enough? She doesn't say. She doesn't have to. She's seen this before. Too many times. This is the part where the stains do the talking. Because in the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a concept. It was evidence, social currency, and whether or not your body offered up that crimson signature could decide your fate. So, let's talk about that sheet. You're expected to bleed on your wedding night. If you do, congratulations. You pass the test. There may be a feast, a prayer of thanks, a knowing smirk from someone who shouldn't be smirking. But if not, things get tense, fast. Because medieval Europe lived under the myth of the inevitable bloodstain, the belief that a woman's first time would always result in bleeding. Scientifically shaky, but doggedly persistent. Historians still argue whether this expectation originated more from bad anatomy or from a need to control women's bodies through fear. And when the evidence didn't appear, people got creative or suspicious. Sometimes it was handled quietly. The bride or a sympathetic maid would prick a finger, squeeze out a drop. Sometimes animal blood was smeared. Goat, chicken, pig, whatever was on hand. In Poland, there's record of a bride who tucked a fresh beet under the covers, points for improvisation. But other times, failure to produce that red signal led to very public consequences. In some towns, the sheets were examined by relatives the next morning. Yes, really. One 14th century French wedding manual recommended that a trusted female elder be stationed in the couple's room overnight to confirm the bride's honesty. Talk about a third wheel. And if the bride didn't pass the test, the marriage could be annulled. That meant the dowry returned, the bride shamed, the husband free to remarry. In extreme cases, families even sued one another. Your daughter tricked us. Your son didn't even try. There are court records from Tuscany in the 1300s detailing lawsuits over unbloodied sheets. One groom argued his wife was not a virgin because she showed no modest resistance. The judge's response? Call a midwife to examine her. in court, with spectators, because dignity was definitely not part of the process. Meanwhile, midwives were often pulled into these disputes as reluctant referees, tasked with examining young women to determine whether their hymen was intact, a completely unreliable method, but widely accepted at the time. The consequences were chilling. A woman could be punished for being a victim of assault, for having an active life before marriage, for a body that didn't bleed according to myth, or for simply marrying a man who was, shall we say, ineffective, and looking to shift the blame. One noblewoman, Eleanor of Aquitaine's distant cousin, was accused of deceiving her husband because she didn't bleed. Her family had to bribe a bishop to stop the annulment. The sheet was burned. The scandal wasn't. And this obsession with proof wasn't limited to women. Let's turn the table for a second. Men were expected to perform, and when they couldn't, accusations flew the other way. If a groom failed to consummate the marriage, especially a politically important one, the blame game began. Was he cursed? Was witchcraft involved? Did he have unholy preferences? Some kings were pressured into humiliating tests. In 1382, Charles VI of France's cousin was forced to undergo a public virility trial. Imagine a nobleman stripped and examined by court physicians, tasked with proving he could perform, and that he hadn't perhaps already done so with someone he shouldn't have. But back to the sheets. In parts of England, they were kept, dried, folded, stored in cedar trunks, a grim little trophy. In Spain, they were sometimes paraded during festivals as proof of the village's virtue. In Italy, not producing one could mean the bride was taken back to her family, disgraced. There's a documented case from 1478 Florence in which the entire town debated whether a bride's stains were red enough. They formed a committee. Yes, a sheet committee. Verdict? Indecisive. The couple was sent to try again. Romantic. And of course, all of this ignored the fact that virginity is not a measurable condition. Not medically, not morally. But medieval people didn't know that, or didn't care. They weren't testing biology. They were testing obedience. And here's a side note. This culture of proof led to some very awkward forgeries. In Hungary, a cottage industry sprang up for virginity kits, little packets of animal blood and herbs meant to simulate the proper aftermath. Folk midwives passed them around like illicit recipes. Some even came with scripts. What to say, when to moan, when to cry. Because if you could perform purity, maybe you'd be safe. Sometimes you wonder, were these women afraid? Or just savvy? But even when the act itself was successful, the emotional toll remained. Sex, instead of being an act of closeness, became an audit. Something to survive, something to pass. You might be a wife now. You might even grow to care for your husband. But this first night has taught you something important. Your value is measured in stains. Your privacy, expendable. Your voice, mostly silent. Still you whisper to yourself, it's done. The fire dies down. The room grows quiet. And somewhere the maid carrying your sheet walks slowly through the courtyard, hoping no one looks too closely. You try to rest. Really you do. But you keep thinking about the calendar. Not just today, but tomorrow, and next Friday, and Lent, and the feast day of St. Agnes. And that one weird rule about not sharing a bed if the moon is full and your husband has a head cold. Because here's what no one tells you. Medieval sex came with a schedule. A sprawling, contradictory, absolutely exhausting schedule. And missing a date? That was fine. Missing a forbidden date? Sin. Eternal. Sulfur-flavored sin. Let's unpack your bedroom planner. It's Tuesday, which is actually fine, unless it's a Tuesday after Epiphany or before Pentecost, or within the 40-day buffer zone of any major church event. The rules vary depending on which region you live in. In some towns, even numbered days are frowned upon. In others, it's the odd ones that get you glared at by passing monks. And then there's Friday. Always Friday. No sex on Fridays, full stop. That was the day Christ died, and you are not supposed to be celebrating the mysteries of the flesh while the Savior suffers. Wednesday's sketchy too, associated with betrayal. Sunday's a no-no for obvious reasons. Saturday's dicey if you're planning to take communion the next morning. And that's before you consider Lent, Advent, the 12 days of Christmas, and the random 6 weeks where the bishop just seems to be in a mood. One early 13th century guidebook for confessors included a chart. Yes, a literal sin chart, marking which days were acceptable for relations, which were dubious, and which required immediate penance. Imagine a medieval version of Google Calendar, where your bedroom schedule is overlaid with feast days, fasting windows, planetary alignments, and suspicious goat births. If goat gives twins on Tuesday, abstain till Corpus Christi. Of course, this wasn't just about timing. There were rules for how you did it. Missionary was fine, if somber. Quiet, in darkness, with intent to conceive. Eye contact optional, but probably discouraged. Everything else? Taboo. From behind? Nope. Standing? Forbidden. With enthusiasm? Highly suspect. And don't even think about speaking Latin during it. Someone might mistake you for a demon. That did happen, by the way. In one German folktale, a woman reciting a prayer during climax was accused of witchcraft and taken to the bishop. He reportedly asked, "Was it the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene?" Theologians took these things seriously. Entire treatises were written on what constituted unnatural acts. One monk described pleasure without procreation as watering a tree without roots. Another described it as setting fire to God's house with your trousers down. And it wasn't just clergy writing about it. Poets and playwrights got in on the action. The Roman de la Rose, a wildly popular 13th century allegorical poem, dances between romantic metaphor and graphic cautionary tale. It was basically medieval Europe's version of reading Cosmo under the covers, scandalous, poetic, and surprisingly obsessed with flowers. Now some historians argue that these harsh teachings were often ignored in practice, that people were people, and behind closed doors, they did what they pleased. But here's the thing. The rules still existed. They shaped the culture. They shaped the guilt. And guilt in the medieval world was a full-time job. Confessors asked very specific questions. Did you lie with your spouse during prohibited days? Did you allow impure thoughts? Did you move your hips in a way unbecoming of Christ? Okay, maybe not that last one, but only because they didn't have the vocabulary. And when you confessed? The penance varied. Sometimes it was 10 Hail Marys, sometimes a pilgrimage, occasionally public shame. One particularly unfortunate baker in 1321 was made to crawl through the market square after being caught with his wife on All Saints' Eve. He reportedly shouted, "I was testing the bread." No one believed him. It gets weirder. In parts of rural Ireland, there were local superstitions that sex on certain nights could cause crops to fail. Yes, your fertility could ruin the wheats. In other regions, people believed having sex too close to a church might disturb the relics. Which raises the question, who's out there doing it near relics? But we digress. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer logistics of all this. You'd need a monk, an almanac, and a stack of saint trading cards just to plan a half-decent honeymoon. And even then, you'd probably still sin, just less imaginatively. And heaven forbid you should enjoy it. Because pleasure wasn't just discouraged, it was pathologized. Doctors, yes doctors, warned that too much excitement could cause imbalance in the humors. Women, in particular, were warned against excessive delight. which might cause wandering womb syndrome, hysteria, or melancholy of the uterus. Spoiler, not real. But try telling that to your husband after the village apothecary prescribes you powdered emerald. Even music wasn't safe. Songs with rhythmic intention were frowned upon in bedrooms. One bishop banned the use of lutes entirely, claiming their chords tickled the devil's feet. That same bishop later commissioned a new organ for his chapel, with unusually curvy carvings on the pipes. People noticed. But you? You're just trying to get through the week without committing eternal damnation via spooning. Which brings us to this fringe tidbit. Some wealthier couples employed bedroom confessors. These were private priests who would advise on when it was safe to have sex, when to abstain, and how not to anger heaven in the process. Basically, celestial coaches for your love life. Imagine booking a confessional just to ask, okay, so if it's St. Bridget's Eve and I've fasted for 2 days, but we haven't consummated since Candlemas, is tonight okay? Or am I summoning Beelzebub? The answer was usually, fast for 1 more day, say 3 psalms, and definitely keep your feet covered. At some point, you have to laugh, because between all the charts, the saints, and the Forbidden Wednesdays, it starts to feel less like a spiritual path and more like losing a very complicated board game with horny dice. But beneath the absurdity, there's something darker. These rules weren't just about God. They were about control, about making people afraid of their own bodies, about making sure women didn't enjoy too much, about ensuring sex remained a duty, not a joy. And so you lie there, staring at the ceiling beams, counting saints in your head like sheep. Tomorrow is a feast day. The day after is uncertain. You'll have to ask someone, maybe the priest, maybe the herbalist, with a slightly smug smile. Until then, you keep your hands above the blankets. Someone's pounding on the chapel door. Again, it's late. Too late for prayers, but apparently not too late for complaints. Another husband, red-faced and sweating, demands help. His wife won't lie with him, or maybe she will, too eagerly. Either way, he suspects witchcraft, or heresy, or something worse, lust. The monk sighs, stands up, and reaches for his ink-stained ledger. Time to log another sin of the flesh. Because if you thought the church only scolded peasants, think again. Even kings weren't safe, and monks? Don't even get started. You're living in an age where celibacy is preached from every pulpit, but no one can seem to follow it. The bedroom isn't just a battleground for sinners. It's a total theological minefield, one where even the holiest get caught in their own robes. Let's start with the kings. Medieval monarchs were expected to produce heirs, but also to model piety. A tricky combination. Some tried to abstain entirely for months, even years. Edward the Confessor reportedly avoided his wife altogether out of devotion. Historians still argue whether he was celibate by choice, or just deeply terrified of her. Then there's King Louis IX of France, who was so worried about the sin of sex that he counted his marital acts and confessed each one. He even left court mid-war to go home and fulfill his conjugal duties because his confessor said marital neglect was a greater sin than pride. So yes, medieval rulers could fight the Mongols and still fear a frown from their priest. But while kings were wringing their hands, monks were writing poetry, spicy poetry, cloistered gardens, forbidden fruit, blushing metaphors. Entire monastic libraries developed soft-core subtext wrapped in theological metaphors. It was like ASMR for the devout. Take the Carmina Burana, a manuscript of poems written by scholars and monks in the 11th and 12th centuries. You know the opening song probably. That big thunderous choir piece that plays in every dramatic movie trailer? Yeah, that's from this. And buried deeper in the manuscript are lyrics about drinking, gambling, and explicit, often hilarious, romantic escapades. One poem describes a monk falling in love with a baker's daughter, sneaking out of the cloister to steal a kiss under the moon. Another describes a nun and a friar debating theology, and then undressing each other using metaphors about the Book of Psalms. Not exactly Vatican approved. Still, many monasteries functioned like tiny academic cities. Scholars inside were allowed to read, write, and, unofficially, explore the boundaries of what was permitted. Some texts were meant to warn, others were clearly meant to entertain. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some abbeys, monks secretly copied pagan love spells between their Latin texts. One such spell from a manuscript in Würzburg included instructions for mixing wine with rue and whispering the name of Venus at midnight. It's scribbled right next to a treatise on divine grace, the duality. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Many reformers pushed for tighter monastic discipline. Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, wrote furious letters accusing monks of chasing perfume and verse instead of salvation. He had a point. One monk from Cluny reportedly wore silk under his habit for comfort. The same monk also kept a small mirror in his cell, which was absolutely not allowed. Meanwhile, the parish priests were having struggles of their own. Technically, clergy were supposed to be celibate, but enforcement was spotty at best. Records from England, France, and Germany in the 12th century are riddled with complaints about priests with live-in housekeepers, often women who bore them children. One bishop described visiting a parish where the priest had 7 children, all referred to as nephews in public, but dressed in red like tiny cardinals. The church's response? Sometimes a fine, sometimes a scolding. Occasionally, reassignment. Far away, preferably somewhere with fewer distractions. This created tension within the church itself. High-ranking bishops thundered against lust in their sermons, while quietly funding the education of their illegitimate sons. Monks denounced earthly pleasures, while composing love songs. Priests performed weddings by day and confessed their own guilt by candlelight. You lived in a world of contradiction, one where sex was denounced from the pulpit and winked about behind tapestries, a place where the most forbidden desire could be penned in Latin, sealed in wax, and read aloud in private, for penance or pleasure. And so, the people noticed. They watched their priests fumble through sermons about chastity while eyeing the baker's niece. They heard rumors of abbots with hidden wives, bishops with brothels tucked under rented inns, and friars who traded prayers for favors. And they joked. Oh, how they joked. One popular tavern rhyme from the Low Countries went, "The monk says no, the monk says fast, but under moon he loves quite fast." Not Shakespeare, but the sentiment holds. Still, that didn't stop the church from trying. Councils met. Rules were rewritten. One famous edict from the Lateran Council demanded priests dismiss their concubines. The result? A sudden uptick in maidservants with baby cradles. Even in the confessional, things got complicated. Imagine being a priest, listening to the sins of your flock, while harboring your own. Imagine confessing to another priest who may have just returned from the same maidservant you visited. Imagine trying to offer guidance when your hands aren't exactly clean. There's something tragic and deeply human about it. You live in a world obsessed with purity, a world that treats desire like disease, but no one, not kings, not monks, not even the holiest men can live up to the ideals. And the result? Whispers in the chapel, forbidden letters, hidden kisses, silent shame. You stare at the crucifix above your bed and wonder, is God really keeping score? Or is it just the bishop with his ink-stained ledger and endless opinions? Either way, you pray a little, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Because in this world, even celibacy comes with strings attached. You hear something in the night. Not footsteps, not wind, something heavier. Breathing, maybe. The creak of old wood. The sudden chill along your spine like a cold finger tracing your neck. And that's when you remember the sermon. The one where the priest warned that demons watch you sleep, that they whisper through your dreams, that they slide under doors and into sheets and feed off the fire of your flesh, especially when you're alone. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't just a sin, it was an invitation, not for romance, not for scandal, but for the devil himself, or more accurately, his agents. Let's talk succubi and incubi. Succubi, female demons who seduced men in their dreams, draining them of strength, will, and sometimes, according to some manuals, life itself. Incubi, their male counterparts, allegedly stronger, rougher, known for visiting sleeping women and leaving them exhausted, marked, or mysteriously pregnant. People didn't just believe in these creatures. They feared them, studied them, blamed them for everything they couldn't explain. Woke up sticky and ashamed? Incubus. Felt desire while dreaming? Succubus. Had an affair and got caught? Definitely demons. Medieval theologians took this very seriously. The Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century handbook on witchcraft, devoted entire chapters to demonic intercourse. It explained how demons collected seed, stored it, and used it to impregnate women in painstaking and completely fictional detail. They even speculated about temperature. Yes, demon sperm temperature. Someone got paid to write that. You couldn't win. If you enjoyed sex, possessed. If you didn't enjoy it, repressed, probably also possessed. Women who resisted men were sometimes said to be protected by Satan, while women who wanted men too much were said to consort with him. There was a real case in 1347 England where a nun claimed she was visited nightly by a dark man with yellow eyes. She said he whispered in Latin, touched her hands, and left no footprints. The bishop's court tried her for possession. They made her sleep in a church nave under watch. Nothing happened. She was fined anyway. Historians still argue whether these stories were psychological, spiritual, or just the result of vivid dreams and intense repression. But in the Middle Ages, these weren't just stories. They were threats. Even impotence could be blamed on demons. If a husband couldn't perform, people didn't always suspect poor diet or nerves. No, they assumed witchcraft, a hex, a charm, something buried under the doorstep or tied in knots behind the barn. There's one documented French trial from 1452 where a man accused his neighbor's wife of cursing his manhood. She was brought before the bishop's tribunal. They searched her home, found herbs, cords, and a dried frog nailed to the doorframe. Verdict? Guilty. She was ordered to burn the items, repent publicly, and promise never to tie knots again. And those knots? Literal. The knot magic theory was widespread. It was believed witches could prevent a man from consummating his marriage by tying 3 knots in a cord and hiding it in the wedding chamber. No untie, no try. Weddings were often followed by a quiet search of the room. Under pillows, beneath floorboards, inside boots, just in case a jealous ex or spiteful rival had hexed the bed. It gets weirder. In German folklore, demons didn't just sneak into beds. They climbed down chimneys. Some people slept with iron scissors under their pillows. Others sprinkled salt in a ring around the bed. One 14th century guide even recommended writing the names of the 4 evangelists on each bedpost, just to be safe. You weren't paranoid, you were cautious. And that fear wasn't just supernatural, it was deeply, painfully real. Because the body was seen as porous, open to influence, you could be holy one day and overrun the next. It wasn't just your soul at risk, it was your biology. Lust weakened you, made you vulnerable, let demons in. That's why dreams were policed so heavily. Monks were warned to sleep on wooden boards, hands folded, minds clear. One order forbade soft bedding altogether, fearing it encouraged fleshly temptation. Another mandated a daily prayer before bed. Lord, seal my senses against Satan's seduction. And if you had a nocturnal emission, that had a name: pollution. Theologians argued whether it counted as a sin. Some said no, if it was accidental. Others said yes, if the dream was impure. Many agreed. Better safe than sorry. Confess it. Some monasteries had monks track these incidents in personal journals. Woke up soiled? Write it down. Report it to your superior. Fast for 2 days. Repeat. Imagine the shame, the silence, the ache of being young, alone, hormonal, and convinced that your own body is a gateway to hell. And this wasn't limited to men. Women too were suspected, especially if they spoke of strange dreams, touched themselves, showed too much pleasure. Midwives were sometimes accused of invoking spirits during childbirth. If a child was born with deformities, some blamed a demon having entered the womb during conception. Which brings us to this eerie little fringe fact. In 14th century Italy, there was a folk belief that if a candle flickered too much during sex, it meant a demon was present. Some couples would blow out all flames to prevent watching eyes, but that only made the fear worse. What if it was already inside? You lie in bed now, heart thudding, blanket pulled high. The house is quiet, the fire low. And then, the floor creaks. You freeze. It's probably nothing. Probably. You clutch your pendant, whisper a prayer, and hope that whatever slinks through the night is only passing through. Because in this world, it's not enough to fear the church, or your neighbors, or yourself. You have to fear the darkness itself. There's a coin on the table. Copper, worn, stamped with the local lord's crest. You know what it means, and so does your confessor. You didn't sin with your hands, or your thoughts, or even your body. You thought about sinning, and now it's time to pay. Because in the medieval world, desire had a price tag. And if you couldn't be good, you could at least be fined. Welcome to the age of the sins of the flesh tax, where your soul could be cleaned with silver, your shame measured in pennies, and your urges managed like livestock. Just follow the payment plan. The church had long recognized one fundamental truth. People would keep breaking the rules. So rather than simply punish them, why not profit a little? Enter penitential tariffs, a kind of medieval spiritual pricing guide for every kind of carnal misconduct. Lustful thought, a coin. Premarital touch, 2 coins. Full-on romp in the hay? That's worth a small fortune, or a few dozen Our Fathers, depending on your purse. By the 11th century, manuals called penitentials laid out incredibly detailed sin tables. Think spiritual itemized billing. Kissing with intent, 5 days fasting. Manual stimulation, 10 days, bread and water. Intercourse outside marriage, 30 to 60 days. Fasting or equivalent silver. Intercourse during Lent, triple that with a nun. Hope you have savings. Some clergy even offered conversion charts. How many coins equals how many days of penance? One abbot reportedly quipped, "For the right donation, a man could be made holy again by Tuesday." Sarcastic? Sure. Accurate? Alarmingly so. And here's the fringe detail that feels like satire but isn't. In some regions, priests tracked repeat customers. A village priest in early 14th century Wales reportedly kept a locked ledger, initials only, detailing locals' favorite sins and corresponding payments. If you came back for the same mistake too often, the price went up. One parchment reads simply, TW 4 silver, candle blessing, 3 nights penance, adultery again. But this wasn't just about individual sin. It became a system. Churches were maintained with this income, roads paved, altars built. Some bishops even included expected sin revenue in their annual budgets. Imagine a diocese balancing the books and saying, We're 40 groats short. Better schedule another sermon on fornication. Confession itself became part of the machine. You knelt, whispered, admitted, and then received your tariff. If you were too poor to pay in coin, you might be asked for labor. Build a fence, sweep the nave, scrub the church steps barefoot in silence. Or, if you were lucky, just repeat enough prayers to make your tongue numb. But some sins were too public for quiet confession. If the affair became gossip, or if a child was born, the church might demand a court confession. Yes, a trial. Not always with judges, but definitely with witnesses. Sometimes a bishop, occasionally a noble with too much time on his hands. And the penalty? More than silver. A woman might be paraded through the village in a shift, her hair down, a rope around her neck. A man might be flogged in the square. One chronicler tells of a miller forced to wear a wooden phallus on his head for a week, a literal and figurative cap of shame. And yet, people kept sinning. They fell in love, they lusted, they longed, and the church kept adjusting the prices. Which brings us to the indulgence trade. Indulgences started as spiritual get-out-of-jail cards. Pay a fee, receive a pardon, usually for the afterlife consequences of your sins. But over time, the line between indulgence and pay-to-play purity blurred dangerously. By the late Middle Ages, you could buy an indulgence in advance. Planning to sin next week? Get your paperwork now. One satirical poem describes a man buying forgiveness for future temptations not yet fully imagined. And while indulgences weren't technically supposed to cover carnal misdeeds, guess what kind of sins people were most eager to cleanse? But there were limits. Some sins couldn't be priced, at least not without scandal. Bestiality, rape, incest. These were punishable by more than coins: exile, branding, even death. And yet even here, status made a difference. A noble caught with a servant might receive a quiet penance. A servant caught with a noble's daughter? Public whipping, or worse. Because like everything else, this moral economy favored the wealthy, the landowning, the titled. They could afford more forgiveness, more absolution, more second chances. You counted pennies, counted rosaries, counted days since your last mistake. And sometimes the shame didn't even come from action, just suspicion. You looked at someone too long, laughed too loud, touched your own wrist when no one was watching. That's when the gossip started. That's when you found the coin in your hand and knew confession wouldn't be optional this week. And then there's the story of Father Petrus, a priest in Bohemia who was known for taking alternative payments. If you couldn't offer coin, he'd accept livestock, or ale, or in more whispered circles, favors. Eventually, he was caught, not defrocked, just relocated to a smaller village with fewer goats. But the system went on. The confession booth, the whisper, the sigh, the coin. You place it on the table, a silent apology, a tiny prayer. Maybe you'll be forgiven. Maybe not. But at least for tonight, your soul's account is paid in full. There's a bottle under the bed. Small, stoppered with wax, smells like vinegar and wild mint and something sharp you can't quite name. You didn't buy it from the apothecary. Too risky. It came from her. The widow with the crooked smile and the willow charm around her neck. The one who lives at the edge of the village, where herbs grow tall and secrets bloom thicker than grass. You paid in silence. She didn't ask questions, just handed it over and said, "Boil it in red wine. Pray if you like." Because when the church doesn't answer your questions, someone else always will. Welcome to the world of medieval love potions, contraceptive brews, and fertility charms. A simmering cauldron of folklore, fear, and desperation. Where every herb has a whisper, every root a consequence, and every bottle could either save your life or take it. Let's start with the basics. You don't want to get pregnant. Not now. Not with that man. Maybe not ever. But the church doesn't offer options. No talk of timing, no safe window, no protection, just abstinence, or the command to be fruitful, whether you're ready or not. So women turn to each other, to whispered recipes passed between midwives, to charms scratched into wood, to dirt and desire magic that predates even Christianity. Some of it is harmless, symbolic. Wear a sprig of rue in your girdle to ward off conception. Hang vervain in the doorway. Rub crushed lily on your belly. Sing a rhyme while walking backward under a new moon. Others, more intense. There's a Roman recipe that survived well into the 14th century. Grind silphium, now extinct. Mix with honey and pennyroyal, and drink before dawn. Pennyroyal, by the way, is toxic in high doses. Very toxic, but it was one of the few known abortifacients, and it shows up over and over in medieval herbals, always in the margins, always deniable. Another potion calls for beaver testicles dried over ash. Yes, really. Known as castoreum, it was believed to calm the womb and prevent conception. That one came with a side note. Do not overboil, lest it lose potency. Or perhaps gain it. Accounts vary. And then there's the more fringe stuff. In parts of Eastern Europe, women carried snakeskins under their skirts. In Italy, a charm made of dried wolf spleen was thought to repel men entirely. One record from a French convent mentions a nun who rubbed garlic and soot on her thighs before bed, claiming it would burn the devil's desire from the air. Effective? Probably not. But what matters isn't the science, it's the agency. These women weren't witches. They were survivors, navigating a world where their bodies were managed, not understood. And when the church offered no tools, they built their own. And the fear ran deep. Because even talking about preventing pregnancy could earn you a confession, or worse, an accusation. In 1343, a midwife in Avignon was put on trial for tampering with God's design. Her crime, providing a newlywed with a charm that involved fennel seeds, a ribbon, and a whispered phrase. She refused to name the phrase under oath. She was exiled. And yet the knowledge persisted. Tucked into recipe books, hidden in family Bibles, scribbled in the margins of psalters between saints' names and flower weights. In one monastery, a scribe copied a medical treatise that, between paragraphs on fevers and gout, included a side note. For unwanted quickening, grind sage and redwort, mix with vinegar, drink before the cock crows. Someone later crossed it out, then wrote it again in smaller letters underneath. Because the fear wasn't just physical, it was eternal. Church doctrine taught that preventing pregnancy interfered with God's will, that every act of intimacy was meant to yield fruit. Using potions? That was theft, blocking life, a sin against the natural order. But for many women, the choice was between sin and starvation. You already have 3 mouths to feed. You live in one room. You share a bed. The winters are long. The bread is thin. You love your children fiercely, but another could kill you, or them, or all of you. So you slip the bottle from beneath the bed. You hold it in your hand. And you whisper the same prayer the widow whispered when she handed it to you. Let it not be a sin to survive. Now, here's a quirky fringe fact you won't forget. Some love potions weren't about contraception. They were about attraction. Aphrodisiacs. One infamous 12th century recipe mixed cinnamon, crushed ants, and the ashes of a sparrow's tongue. The idea? Stir it into wine and serve to your intended. Bonus points if they were a monk. Other recipes involved toad skin dried in sunlight or the fat of a black rooster. A few even called for mixing menstrual blood into food or drink, a powerful binding spell in Balkan folklore. Were these dangerous? Absolutely. Effective? Occasionally. Symbolic? Always. Because when your choices are few and your body is policed, even the smallest potion can feel like power, like something in your hands, when everything else is out of them. Men use them too, by the way. There's a documented case of a knight who carried dried mistletoe in his codpiece for vigorous result. He later blamed a rash on it. No word on the results. And in monasteries, secret brews were sometimes made to suppress desire, a kind of spiritual cold shower. Sage, hops, and camphor boiled down to cool the blood. A monk in Saxony reportedly drank it every Thursday. He still confessed weekly. So you boil the herbs, you sip the bitter wine, you lie back, heart racing. Will it work? You don't know. Will you burn for this? You've stopped asking. Because in this world, where men write the rules and priests count the days, a woman with a bottle isn't just making tea. She's making a choice. And that might be the most forbidden act of all. You're late. Not to church, not to market. You're late in that way, and everyone knows it. The midwife doesn't say anything at first, just gives you a look. Not cruel, not kind, just tired. She's seen this before. She presses a hand to your belly and nods, quietly, then closes the door behind her. You sit down, and for the first time you realize how little control you actually have. Because in the Middle Ages, getting pregnant was a gamble, giving birth was a battlefield, and not getting pregnant often required a mix of luck, folklore, and sheer desperation. Welcome to the world of medieval birth control, a landscape of wild guesses, herbal remedies, abstinence by scheduling, and deep, deep regret. Let's start with what didn't exist: reliable contraception. No pills, no condoms? Well, not really, we'll get to that. No IUDs, just a long list of maybe this will work options. Some dangerous, some useless. Most repeated so many times they gained the weight of tradition, even if they failed 80% of the time. One of the most popular methods? Withdrawal. Yep. That old trick, mentioned in texts, practiced in secret, and condemned in pulpits. Church doctrine called it the sin of Onan, referencing the biblical figure who spilled his seed on the ground and was immediately smited by God. So, you know, bad Yelp review. Other methods? Far stranger. Take crocodile dung. Ancient Egyptian women reportedly used it as a pessary. Dried, shaped, and inserted before intercourse? The logic? Maybe the acidity would kill sperm. Or maybe it would just kill the mood. Either way, the idea survived into some early medieval manuscripts, copied by monks with confused expressions and no field experience. There were also recipes involving mercury, lead, or arsenic. Yes, arsenic. One potion recommended boiling pennyroyal with bits of metal to seal the womb. Side effects included nausea, organ damage, and, in some cases, death, which technically did prevent further pregnancies. Other preventatives were more symbolic than medical. Wear a weasel's testicle around your neck. Tie a raven's feather into your hair. Bury a lock of your hair in the north corner of your garden. Hold a frog against your stomach during a full moon while reciting Psalm 51 backwards. Effective? Debatable. But in a world with no options, ritual felt like control. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Often, women didn't even know they were pregnant until the 4th or 5th month. There were no tests, no ultrasounds, just a skipped cycle, a queasy stomach, and the creeping certainty that your future was about to shrink into a very small room with very few doors. And those few doors? Narrow, dangerous, sometimes fatal. Let's talk condoms, or what passed for them. There is scattered evidence of linen sheaths soaked in herbal solutions, tied at the base with a ribbon. But they were rare, expensive, and mostly used to prevent disease, not pregnancy. The oldest known illustration appears in a 15th century Italian medical manual, showing a man donning a delicate pouch while his partner looks on with mild disinterest. Romantic. Most people didn't use them. Most didn't even know about them. And if they did, they were more likely to rely on the rhythm method, avoiding sex during certain phases of the moon, certain saint days, or certain crop cycles. One treatise advised abstaining if frogs were mating loudly at night, because the blood is too hot then. Science. And the shame? Overwhelming? Women weren't supposed to want to prevent pregnancy. They were supposed to accept it, welcome it, even when it could kill them. Because childbirth was a high-risk event, there was no sterile equipment, no pain relief beyond prayers and damp cloths. Midwives worked with what they had: hands, oil, herbs, and the knowledge passed from one tired woman to another. Complications could mean death, for mother, child, or both. One chronicler in 1386 noted a local priest who performed 6 hasty baptisms in a single day, each for a newborn expected not to last the hour. And if a woman died in childbirth, she was sometimes buried with the child still inside her, a tragedy wrapped in silence. So yes, some women risked it all for a brew, a charm, a sliver of hope. Let's pause here for a quirky fringe fact. In certain French villages, women believed eating hare testicles would prevent conception. The same belief existed in parts of Germany, though there the recommendation was to carry them, not consume them. Historians still debate whether this was based on rabbit fertility, lots of babies, or pure coincidence. Meanwhile, others went the opposite route. They desperately wanted children, but couldn't conceive. That too brought shame, accusations of witchcraft, or being cursed. One barren noblewoman was accused of sleeping with the devil because she hadn't gotten pregnant after 5 years of marriage. Can't win either way. So, what did people do? They copied. They whispered. They passed knowledge along like contraband, between friends, through midwives, sometimes encoded in embroidery or painted into the margins of tapestries. One 14th century wall hanging in England shows a woman harvesting herbs with a wry smile. Historians suspect it's a subtle nod to a known contraceptive route. Because women knew what the church didn't want to say, they were the ones taking the risk, every time, every night. And while theologians debated sin and angels counted transgressions, the widow on the edge of the village kept mixing her herbs. She wasn't a saint or a savior, but she listened, and she never asked you why. So tonight, you sit by the hearth, watch the firelight flicker, run a hand over your stomach, still flat, but heavy with dread. You sip something bitter, and pray that this time, the silence that follows will be enough. There's a knock, soft, coded, almost polite. You open the door and see the shawl first, then the eyes. Wrinkled, sharp, and tired. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. You step aside. The midwife is here, not just for birth, or blood, or the quiet moments between. In the medieval world, she is doctor, priest, surgeon, secret keeper. When no one else will help you, not your priest, not your husband, certainly not the church, you go to her. Tonight, it's not about pregnancy. It's about something less visible, the fear creeping up your spine, the memory of something taken, or something you gave, too soon, too late, or not at all. The midwife's hand is warm on your arm. You breathe, finally. Because in a world where your body is everyone's business, she's the only one who treats it like yours. Let's pull back. Across medieval Europe, midwives held a strange liminal role. Respected, feared, needed, sometimes accused, always watched. They weren't ordained. weren't formally trained, at least not the way monks or physicians were, but they knew everything. How to deliver a child breech, how to stem a postpartum hemorrhage, how to distinguish a stillbirth from a silent one, how to cut a cord with a chipped knife sterilized in ale and not lose a drop of extra blood. But they also knew what couldn't be said aloud, that sometimes women needed help ending what had begun, that sometimes a bruise was not a mystery, that sometimes a girl showed up crying and refused to say who had touched her, and the midwife nodded, handed her a warm drink and said, "Sleep now, I'll sit with you." They lived in a constant tension between medicine and heresy. One moment, they were being paid in eggs and wool for delivering a noble's fifth son. The next, they were hauled before the bishop for knowledge of forbidden roots. Because remember, healing without permission was suspect, especially when done by women. That didn't stop them. They kept their remedies folded in linen, their charms stitched into apron hems, their recipes memorized. Some kept coded books, pages of astrological calendars, bloodletting charts, and herb notes written in looping script. If you couldn't read Latin, you couldn't accuse them of spelling out sin. And the power they held. Terrifying. They knew who'd had a child and who hadn't, who'd miscarried, who'd come seeking a bitter tea and returned 3 days later pale and silent, who had bruises on thighs and excuses about stairs. They knew what the church wouldn't ask, what men wouldn't admit. And most importantly, they shared that knowledge. This is how you survive. Through whisper networks. Married women pass tips behind laundry lines. A daughter watches her mother crush rue leaves in oil. A sister learns how to count her days, not just with saints, but with symptoms, none of it written down. All of it carved in memory, and sometimes in quiet rebellion. In some towns, midwives formed informal guilds, small circles of trust. They met by candlelight, shared new treatments, guarded each other from suspicion. If one was accused of witchcraft, the others moved quickly, bearing the herbs, burning the scrolls, hiding the jars. Were they witches? Number not really, but that didn't matter. To the church, a woman with too much knowledge, especially of sex, birth, and pain, was always a threat. In 1320, a midwife named Sibylla of Meaux was accused of performing forbidden rites during childbirth. Her crime? Whispering prayers not found in any liturgy. She said they were old words, passed from her mother. She was flogged and exiled. A century later, another midwife in Vienna was hanged, not for murder, not for malice, but for assisting a noblewoman in ending a pregnancy conceived through rape. Her defense? She begged me. It didn't matter. And yet, they kept working. One midwife in Ghent reportedly attended over 900 births in her lifetime. Her only payment? A loaf of bread, a pot of ale, and the promise that her name would be passed to every daughter in town. That's how legacy worked. Not in books, but in remembrance. Let's slip in a quirky fact here. Some midwives used animal guides, not for magic, for signaling. One famous Flemish midwife kept a cat that would sit by the door when labor began. Another swore her goose would honk differently, depending on whether a baby was breech or not. Scholars scoff. The women didn't. But it wasn't just about birth. Midwives handled the whole cycle. First blood, first fright, first kiss, the night after, the silence, the fear, the recovery. They were the first to recognize abuse, the last to be thanked. And in a world where your priest called you daughter, but wouldn't sit beside you during miscarriage, she would. So tonight, she sits by your bed, lights a candle, hands you tea, bitter, strong, earthy, says nothing. Because she knows you're not ready to speak. Maybe you never will be. That's fine. She's not here to ask. She's here to listen, to watch, to hold space in a world that never gives you room. You sleep, and she stays. Because that's what midwives did. They stayed. There's shouting in the courtyard. Not loud, controlled, performed. The village elder reads from a scroll. The accused stands barefoot in the mud, head bowed, hands bound. Her dress is stained, her eyes dry. No one touches her yet, not until the ritual is complete. She's been charged with adultery. Her husband swears it. His brother claims he saw her with another man. The priest nods solemnly. And so begins the ancient rhythm: accusation, humiliation, trial. Not in a courtroom, but in the open air beneath God's sky, where truth is measured not in facts, but in public shame. In the medieval world, accusations of adultery were more than scandal. They were spectacle. And the way truth was sought? Equal parts superstition, violence, and deeply flawed logic. Let's walk you through a few examples. Say you're a wife accused of sleeping with someone who wasn't your husband. You deny it. Naturally. But he insists. And in many medieval systems, that was enough to put you on trial. Not for evidence, but for proof through ordeal. One of the most common? Trial by water. You're led to a river. A priest blesses it. You're bound at the ankles and wrists, lowered in slowly. If you sink, innocent, though you might drown before they fish you out. If you float, guilty, because water, being pure, rejects the sinful. Yes, they really believed this. Other regions preferred trial by fire, not burning at the stake, not yet, but ordeals like carrying hot iron a set distance. The wound is bandaged and rechecked in 3 days. If it's healing clean, God has judged you innocent. If it festers, adulteress. And in some areas, there was trial by belly. Here's how it worked. If a woman was suspected of adultery, and especially if she was pregnant, the village elders, or in noble cases, a panel of matrons, would inspect her stomach, not medically, visually. The idea was that a guilty woman's child would sit heavier or off-center. Midwives were sometimes ordered to report whether a baby felt holy. One 14th century case from Bavaria describes a woman accused after rumors spread she had taken long walks with the village blacksmith. At 8 months pregnant, her belly was deemed unnaturally low. She was fined, publicly whipped, and her child denied legitimacy. Historians still argue whether this was law or folk tradition. Either way, it happened. And then there were confessions, often extracted under pressure. Not always torture, though, yes, sometimes that too. More often, it was relentless questioning, social pressure, isolation, or threats. Confess and you'll be forgiven. Deny it and your child might suffer. Or worse, your soul. And let's not forget the men. Yes, men were accused of adultery too, but it was rarer, and usually framed in economic terms. Seducing another man's wife was stealing property. Punishment was typically lighter. Fines, pilgrimage, public penance. Women, however, bore the public cost. They might be forced to wear special clothing, often a shift dyed black or gray. Some towns required women to shave their heads. Others made them stand barefoot at the church door each Sunday for a month, holding a candle as long as their forearm. And in more extreme regions, branding, a mark on the cheek or shoulder, a permanent reminder of sin. One court in Flanders used an iron shaped like a rose, pressed to the upper arm, a symbol of love turned to punishment. What if the woman denied the charge and refused to confess? Then came character witnesses, neighbors, friends, enemies. Did she smile too often? Was she seen with men? Did she sing while washing clothes? Yes, singing could be suspicious, as could looking too happy, especially while alone. One woman in 1352 was accused after being spotted dancing barefoot in her garden. She was unmarried. The town decided that proved temptation. And here's a strange fringe tidbit. In some rural Italian villages, a suspected adulteress might be made to bite bread baked with holy water. If the bread broke clean, she was innocent. If it crumbled oddly, guilt. A communion of suspicion. Not all women suffered in silence. Some fought back. One woman in Prague hurled her trial candle into the priest's lap. Another in Aragon demanded her accuser duel for her honor and found a cousin willing to take up the challenge. She won. The accuser fled town. But these were rare victories. More often, the accused returned home in silence or left altogether. To a convent, to another town, to nowhere. Reputation was everything. A rumor could ruin a life. A confirmed charge could end one. And it wasn't just sexual betrayal people feared. It was power. A woman who broke the rules of desire was dangerous. She couldn't be trusted to obey, to birth, to serve, so she had to be controlled. Sometimes, in tragic irony, it was the midwife, the one who'd helped you survive, who was forced to testify against you. Under oath, with the bishop watching. Imagine that. And yet, some women endured. They walked past the whispers, raised their children, stitched veils over their scars, wrote nothing because they couldn't, but remembered everything. And today, you watch the accused stand still in the mud. The priest ends his prayer. The onlookers begin to drift. The punishment for now is public fasting, but next time could be worse. You catch her eye for a second. She doesn't cry. She just burns, quietly, like coals under wet ash. Because in this world, justice isn't blind. It's watching, and it remembers your name. The first time you see them, you aren't sure what you're seeing. Two boys, sitting too close. A glance held a beat too long. A hand brushing another. Gently, quickly. The kind of gesture you've been taught to ignore. But you feel it. The electric silence between them. The stillness that says more than words ever could. And then the second one smiles. And you realize, this world has always been queer. It just didn't have the permission to say so. Because in the Middle Ages, same-sex love existed everywhere, in cloisters, in castles, in scriptoriums, and side streets, but always hidden in layers of metaphor, poetry, and silence. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. The rules were clear. The punishments were brutal. But the feelings? They didn't care about rules. Let's start in the monasteries. Single-gender spaces, long hours, emotional intimacy, repression, longing, confession. It's not hard to imagine how bonds formed, deep, complicated, and often quietly romantic. Some monks wrote about it, carefully, codified, encrypted in metaphor. One 11th century Benedictine monk described a brother's eyes as windows to a holier flame, and wrote of yearning that sanctifies the soul. Is that platonic? Erotic? Historians still argue, and some just shrug and say, why not both? One letter from a monk named Alcuin to another, named Arno, reads, "No day goes by that I do not ache for your embrace. You are the most beloved of my soul." This was written in Latin, with tears probably. Meanwhile, in noble courts, queer desire slipped into poetry and dance. Troubadours wrote ballads about unattainable love, and while most were directed toward idealized women, some veiled poems clearly referenced men. A few court entertainers performed songs from the perspective of women in love with women, usually as a joke. But underneath the performance, a truth many recognized. And let's be clear, it wasn't always tragic. Yes, the church condemned sodomy, a broad catch-all term that included not just same-sex acts, but anything non-procreative. Yes, there were trials. Yes, punishments included imprisonment, flogging, or, in extreme cases, execution. But in private, many people lived quietly outside the lines. In medieval Arab and Persian cultures, where poetry was king, love between men was openly described. One 13th century Persian manuscript features a young man comparing his lover's body to a perfect garden. There are no fruits I would rather pluck than the smile that ripens when I am near. And no, that is not about gardening. Even in Europe, some queer relationships gained a strange kind of tolerance if they remained discreet, unmarried, and useful. A courtier who made the king laugh, safe. A nun who wrote beautiful hymns, protected. A knight who fought well, even if he preferred stable boys to barmaids, quietly ignored. Sometimes, but not always. Because the risk was real. In 1292, 2 men in Florence were executed after being caught together in a bathhouse. They were named, humiliated, paraded, and finally hanged. No trial. Just an accusation, a priest's blessing, and the sound of rope over oak. Yet Florence also maintained a semi-underground community called the Office of the Knight, a sort of shadow court where cases of male-male relations were investigated, judged, and often let go. The city knew it was happening. It just didn't want it to be visible. Visibility was the danger. Let's drop a fringe fact here. In certain regions, men who danced together too freely at festivals were warned by church officials to keep their eyes lowered and their bodies distant, lest scandal arise. No one ever wrote that about women, because women dancing together was seen as innocent, unthreatening, which made it safer. And yes, women loved women. Letters between nuns from the 12th century speak of deep affection. One writes, "I have folded your letter in my sleeve, where I may keep your words close to my skin." Another describes a kiss that lingers longer than holy thought. Were they lovers? Soulmates? Historians debate, but the language is intimate, physical, longing. There's even a record of a pair of nuns in Germany, buried side by side, hands carved to reach for each other. Their tombstone reads, "In life, inseparable. In death, reunited." The church never explained that one. Queer desire also showed up in accusations, especially during witch trials. Midwives, healers, and unmarried women who lived together were often painted as sexually unnatural. One case in France involved 2 women accused of unnamed affections. The actual trial record? Mostly vague. The punishment? Banishment and shaved heads. Because nothing says don't do that again like enforced baldness. But sometimes the accusations weren't false. Sometimes love bloomed in silence, hidden in kitchens, behind stable doors, beneath cloister arches, in a borrowed shirt, still warm, in a borrowed glance, just a second too long. They were careful. They had to be. Because the church taught that their love was unnatural, but nothing about it felt unnatural. It felt warm, familiar, human. And yet, you couldn't write it. Not openly, not proudly. You had to disguise it with metaphors, with false names, with saints and flowers and shadows. And here's the heartbreaking truth. We don't have many records of queer medieval love, not because it didn't happen, but because people had to destroy the evidence to survive. Letters were burned, poems hidden, names unspoken. But now and then, something slipped through. A scrap of vellum, a scribbled note, a carving on a monastery wall, 2 initials intertwined. You see it and realize they were here, and they were real. Not sinners, not monsters. Just people, touching hands in the dark. The pig is on trial. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. It stands in the wooden enclosure, tied, confused, snorting, while a bailiff reads the charges. Carnal relations with a human. Witnesses are called. Statements are given. A priest is present. The pig is found guilty and sentenced to death. Welcome to one of the strangest corners of medieval life, a place where law, superstition, and sexual anxiety twisted into something truly surreal. Because in this world, even animals could be punished for lust. Let's begin with the beast trials. In medieval Europe, animals could, and did, stand trial. Pigs, goats, roosters, dogs. If they committed a crime, by human standards, they were arrested, tried, and sentenced. Most cases involved property damage or injury. A sow biting a child, a bull trampling a farmer. But every now and then, things got darker. An animal was accused of sexual impropriety, of being a participant in a forbidden act, one so taboo, the church didn't even want to say the words out loud. The documents call it the unnatural crime, or the sin against nature. But we know what they meant. Because bestiality wasn't just a sin in medieval law, it was a capital crime for both parties, and people were absolutely executed for it. Let's look at an actual case. In 1386, in the town of Falaise, France, a sow was put on trial for mauling and violating a child. The townspeople gathered. A formal court was assembled. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, a grotesque parody of justice. It was hanged publicly. The executioner was paid extra for the emotional trauma. Historians debate whether the carnal accusation was real, fabricated, or confused in translation. But it wasn't isolated. Dozens of similar cases appear across France, Italy, and the German states. And the humans? If caught in the act, or even accused, the punishment was execution by fire or hanging. No trial could guarantee mercy. It was considered the ultimate perversion. Worse than adultery, worse than homosexuality. It was betrayal of your species. The most infamous case in Switzerland involved a shepherd accused after a neighbor claimed to have seen him walking strangely with a goat. That was enough. The goat was seized. He was interrogated, tortured, confessed. Both were executed on market day. But why? Why the obsession with this particular crime? Because medieval theology feared the crossing of boundaries between man and woman, between holy and sinful, between human and animal. The further you strayed from the natural order, the more dangerous you became. And sexuality was already loaded with fear. So when an accusation like this surfaced, true or not, it became a ritual cleansing, a communal purging. The trial was as much about reasserting control as punishing the act. Let's not forget the theater of it. Animals were dressed, displayed, given names. Sometimes a public defender was appointed. Yes, there were animal defense lawyers, usually monks, or junior clerks forced into the role. One 15th century pig was defended by a cleric who argued that the sow lacked the faculty of reason. The judge agreed, but ruled that ignorance of sin does not erase its stain. The pig was still burned. And here's a strange, almost comedic fringe fact. Roosters were sometimes tried for laying eggs, because people believed a male bird producing an egg was a sign of demonic possession. One such rooster was condemned in Basel. The egg was destroyed first, just to be safe. Behind the absurdity, though, was something tragically human. People didn't always believe the accusations, but they believed in the need for punishment. If a man was poor, strange, or isolated, easy target. If an animal acted strangely, easy scapegoat. Combine both, you had a public ritual. The church sanctioned these acts, but even secular courts got involved. In rural Normandy, a cow was tried for unnatural behavior after being seen licking its owner with apparent passion. No witnesses claimed to have seen more, but the implication was enough. The cow was executed, the owner fined. And then, as now, gossip traveled faster than justice. Rumors of strange desires, whispered claims. A child disappears, and people don't ask where, they ask why. and soon someone's being dragged into court with no more evidence than a neighbor's side eye and a frightened animal. This wasn't just about morality. It was about fear. Fear of what people might do when no one was watching. Fear of nature's unpredictability. Fear of the boundary between human and beast getting too thin. And yes, sometimes it was projection. A husband sees his wife laugh with a stable hand. The pig gets blamed. A priest hears moaning in the night, blames the devil. A farmer wakes from a dream he can't explain. And suddenly, the family goat is the accused. People were terrified of desire, especially desire that didn't follow the rules. So they made examples, burned flesh, hung sows, dressed up roosters, all to tell a story. We are still in control. We are still pure. We are still safe. Were they? Of course not. But the performance mattered. And it worked. Until the next whisper, the next accusation, the next confused, trembling animal hauled into the square with straw on its hooves and a noose waiting. You step back from the crowd. You see the eyes of the condemned. And whether they belong to a man or a beast, you know someone needs to burn to keep everyone else warm. The book is chained to the lectern. It's heavy, bound in cracked leather, too sacred, or too dangerous to be trusted to wandering hands. You're not allowed to open it, but sometimes when the priest steps away or the light slants just right through the stained glass, you see a flicker of something not quite holy tucked between the Psalms and the sermons. Because here's the secret no one preaches from the pulpit. Even in the holiest libraries, forbidden books whisper. Welcome to the hidden shelf behind the altar, the locked cabinet in the abbey's second scriptorium. This is where the medieval church kept the texts you weren't supposed to read, and sometimes the ones the monks couldn't stop reading. And some of them? Let's just say they were more blush than Bible. Let's start with the manuals. Early church fathers wrote thousands of pages on sin, especially sexual sin, and in doing so, they accidentally created the earliest known guides to sex acts in Europe. Not to celebrate them, of course, but to list them, in detail, for avoidance, naturally. One 11th century cleric wrote a treatise called De Honestate Corporis, on the honesty of the body. The title sounds mild. The content? A thorough, uncomfortable, occasionally graphic inventory of what not to do with your spouse, or your neighbor, or anyone really. The monks copied it anyway, and copied it, and annotated it. Because you know how it goes. The more forbidden, the more fascinating. That's how the Secretum Secretorum became a quiet sensation, a book supposedly penned by Aristotle for Alexander the Great, packed with astrology, medicine, and certain herbal recipes that monks definitely weren't supposed to try. It wasn't overtly sexual, but its hints at magnetic influence, bodily fluids, and womb vapor made it irresistible. It circulated under the table, quietly, reverently, like a dirty joke between saints. Then there's the case of The Golden Ass, a Roman novel by Apuleius, filled with transformation, magic, and yes, erotic escapades. It featured a man turned into a donkey, a few wild affairs, and a vivid tale involving a priestess and a rather ambitious jar of oil. Banned? Naturally. Preserved anyway? Absolutely. Monks copied it into Latin, tucked it behind more respectable texts, and read it for study. Even Ovid, the great Roman poet of love and metamorphosis, found his way into cloisters. His Ars Amatoria, the art of love, was considered extremely inappropriate by church standards. Too poetic, too suggestive, too many metaphors about fruit and rivers and plucking. Yet somehow copies kept appearing, even when bishops ordered them destroyed. One enterprising scribe in 13th century Bologna wrote a Psalter, a book of psalms, with a tiny full Ovid poem hidden between the commentary lines in a near-invisible hand. It's still there today, barely visible without magnification. But it was read, over and over, because that's what monks did. They read, they wrote, they snuck things in. Between the margins, in the gloss, in the capitals of letters, where illuminated monks might draw not just vines and angels, but a naked man chasing a goose. Yes, that's real, and historians still argue what it means. Let's pause for a fringe fact. One scribe in 14th century England drew a full-page diagram labeled The 7 Deadly Sins, and illustrated lust with a nun and a knight in a bath together. No explanation, just vibes. Why were these things allowed? Well, they weren't. But access is power, and scribes had access, and curiosity, and time. A monk might spend years copying one manuscript. That's a lot of time for temptation. Some libraries tried to fight back. They chained books. Literally. Heavy metal links bolted to shelves. But once the book was open, all bets were off. A student in Paris was caught copying impure passages from an Arabic medical manual. His punishment? Forced fasting, public confession, and a vow never to read anything with diagrams again. Yes, diagrams. Some of these books included sketches. Not many survived, but enough to prove that yes, even in a world of darkness and parchment, someone tried to explain where things went. Not that they were accurate. One illustration from a 12th century manuscript shows a couple locked in an embrace so physically impossible, it'd require divine intervention and several chiropractors. But it was there, hidden, annotated in Latin, and almost certainly reread. And then there were the dream books. Books that claimed to interpret visions. Many were banned, but others were tolerated, barely, especially when framed as moral instruction. A dream of kissing a stranger? A sign of spiritual unrest? A dream of flying naked? An omen of rain? Or sin? Or both? But readers knew what they really meant. They read between the lines, and let's not forget the banned translations. The Bible itself, if read in the vernacular in secret without permission, could be punishable by death. In some regions, owning an English Bible was riskier than harboring a fugitive, because knowledge, especially intimate, unfiltered knowledge, was a threat. And knowledge about sex? That was the biggest threat of all. Because if people understood it, if they had words, images, language for their desires, they might start asking dangerous questions about marriage, about pleasure, about control. So the book stayed hidden, copied under candlelight, whispered from monk to monk, read behind closed doors and denied in confession. But they never stopped existing. Because even in a world ruled by faith, fear, and fire, there was always someone, somewhere reading in secret. The goats are restless tonight. You hear them bleating somewhere beyond the hedgerow near the edge of the forest. The wind shifts. The dogs refuse to follow. And you feel it too. That strange prickle between your shoulder blades, like something's watching. You clutch the charm around your neck, whisper a prayer, but it won't help. Not tonight. Because this is Sabbath Eve, and the village is sure someone among you is going into the woods to lie with the devil. Welcome to the fevered world of witchcraft, lust demons, and midnight goat Sabbaths, where every shadow could be a sin, and every moan might summon a demon. You already know the church had plenty of opinions about sex, but nothing terrified it more than uncontrolled, female, secret sexuality. And when that fear needed a shape, it found it in the figure of the witch. She didn't always have a broom, or a pointy hat, or a black cat. Sometimes she just had too much confidence, or too many herbs, or too many lovers, or none at all. Because the witch wasn't just a healer, or a midwife, or an outsider. She was everything the church couldn't control. And when it came to sexuality, that made her the ultimate threat. Let's start with the sex demons. We touched on succubi and incubi earlier, but it gets stranger. By the 15th century, theologians insisted that witches summoned these spirits on purpose, to gain power, or to experience pleasure without punishment. Imagine that. In a world where married sex required permission, slips from the priest, and special calendars to avoid hellfire, the idea of a woman choosing pleasure with a spirit, unforgivable. So the church rewrote the rules. Witches didn't just sin. They didn't just tempt. They held orgies in the woods. That's what the witches' Sabbath became in popular imagination. A night of unholy worship, full of naked dancing, kissing demons, and yes, fornication with the devil, often in goat form. Because apparently, nothing says unholy lust like hooves. Texts from inquisitors, like the Malleus Maleficarum, described these scenes in excruciating detail, which is ironic, considering how often these same authors decried the dangers of fleshly imagery. One chapter even explains how the devil's embrace is cold as ice, yet burns with infernal flame. Very poetic, very suspicious. And let's be honest, the people writing these manuals, not immune to fantasy. Some passages read less like theology and more like frustrated fan fiction. But people believed it. Villages whispered about women who disappeared at night, who gathered herbs by moonlight, who didn't marry, or who did, and still smiled too much, or not enough. A neighbor hears cries through the wall. A baby dies. A man goes limp in bed. Witch. The accusation stuck, even without evidence. Especially without evidence. Let's bring in a fringe tidbit. One 15th century case in Germany involved a woman accused of seducing a bishop in his dreams. He claimed she visited him 3 nights in a row, as a bat, a flame, and a smiling girl in red. She denied everything. She was burned anyway. And yet, beneath the horror, there's something else here. These stories weren't just about sin. They were about desire twisted into fear. Medieval people didn't understand female sexuality. And what they didn't understand, they demonized. Literally. A woman who enjoyed sex must be possessed. A woman who didn't want it? Probably possessed. A woman who had sex outside of marriage and didn't immediately die of shame. She was riding the devil under a crescent moon. And so they made up rituals. Witches, they said, smeared flying ointment on their bodies, made of nightshade, belladonna, henbane, hallucinogenic plants. Dangerous, yes, but effective. Some historians believe this might explain the flying stories. The ointment caused vivid dreams, feelings of floating, transformation. A woman tripping on alkaloids in her hut might very well believe she flew, or danced, or did things forbidden in daylight. And even if she didn't, someone would say she had. Because the witch trials weren't about proof, they were about projection. Someone confesses after torture, mentions a Sabbath, mentions a goat. The scribe writes it down. The image spreads. Then comes the art. Woodcuts of women kissing horned demons, frolicking naked around bonfires. Most of it drawn by men who'd never even seen a real woman naked. But the image stuck. So now, when a woman is accused, people already know what to expect. They've seen the pamphlets. They've read the sermons. They've heard the priest describe the mark, the secret spot on her body, usually on the thigh or breast where the devil touched her. And guess what? Someone will always find it, even if they have to invent it. The trial proceeds. She is stripped, searched, prodded, shamed. Her body becomes evidence, her silence confession, her breath a lie. She is burned. And afterward, they wash their hands and say, God has prevailed. But sometimes a page survives, a charm tucked in the floorboards, A journal scratched into parchment, a symbol carved into wood. Not demonic, just feminine, powerful, real. A reminder? She lived. She danced. She chose. Even in a world that burned her for it. So when you hear the goats crying tonight, when the wind rattles the shutters and the fire dims, remember this. They weren't afraid of witches. They were afraid of women who stopped apologizing. The bells toll, not for mass, not for marriage, but for mourning. Black cloth is draped over doorways. The well is silent. The streets are empty. No carts, no laughter. Just the slow, rhythmic sound of coughing from behind shuttered windows. It's 1348. The Black Death has arrived, and it changes everything, including sex. Because when death walks through your village, faceless and fast, rules begin to crumble. Laws bend, morals blur. The church doors may stay closed, but bedroom doors, some swing open. Some stay locked forever. Tonight, you lie awake, listening to breathing. Yours, your husband's, your neighbor's, and wonder who will still be breathing tomorrow. Let's begin here. Before the plague, the church tried to keep a tight leash on sexual behavior. Feast day bans, position rules, sin tariffs, shame like a second skin. But when the plague came, none of it mattered. What use is confession when the priest is dead? What good are marriage vows when the groom's been buried in a ditch? The rhythms of control, of discipline and shame, collapse, and in the chaos that follows, people change. Some stop sleeping altogether, some sleep with everyone. Because when you think you might die tomorrow, desire doesn't ask permission. And so across Europe, sex surged. Monks wrote furious letters complaining about wantonness among the sick. Cities like Florence and London saw upticks in public indecency, impromptu weddings, and more than a few scandalous parties in homes marked with plague signs. In Avignon, a bishop noted that brothels remained open even when churches were shuttered. Some were converted into hospices, bizarrely enough, a dual function that made for some interesting confessions. Let's not mistake this for joy. This wasn't the fun kind of rebellion. It was desperate, messy, filled with guilt, but it was honest too, a release valve in a pressure-cooked world. You've lived your whole life being told when and how to love, and suddenly, love, or lust, is the only thing that makes you feel alive. The plague broke down more than moral walls. It collapsed class boundaries too. Nobles married commoners. Widows remarried quickly, or never. Sex workers, once condemned, were suddenly essential. If nothing else, they offered comfort in the waiting. And many were dying anyway. Here's your grim fringe fact. During one wave of the Black Death in 1361, death rates among prostitutes were so high that some towns held mass burials specifically for sex workers, often anonymously, with their combs and beads buried beside them. Some saw this as divine punishment. Others saw it as service, women offering final warmth in a world gone cold. And still, the church tried to regain control. Sermons thundered against lust. Priests blamed the plague on immorality, claiming it was God's wrath for sexual sin, especially unmarried sin, especially pleasure. Penance became more intense. Whipping rituals spread. Entire communities of flagellants marched town to town, beating themselves bloody in atonement. Some preached total abstinence. Others, ironically, were later accused of orgies. Because when shame becomes unbearable, sometimes it swings wildly the other way. Let's talk about marriage during plague. In some cities, rules were relaxed to allow for faster unions. People married within hours, sometimes minutes, of meeting. One chronicle from Venice describes a man proposing to a weeping woman at her brother's funeral. They wed that afternoon. He died 3 days later. She remarried a week later. Because life was short, and people were terrified to die alone. Priests couldn't keep up. Bodies piled up faster than blessings. Burials became quick, dirty, and unmarked. A common prayer was, "Let my lover know me, if not the Lord." And then came the superstition. People whispered that sex itself caused the plague. That too much sweat, too much friction, too much moaning stirred the miasmas. Women were blamed for being too tempting. Men were blamed for being too weak. In Paris, a law was proposed to ban unnecessary physical closeness. It passed. It was ignored. Meanwhile, folk remedies exploded. Some said sleeping with virgins could cure the plague. It didn't. Others claimed that abstaining would protect you. Also no. Still others rubbed their skin with a mix of crushed emerald and goat's milk to seal the flesh. Expensive. Useless. One potion, allegedly from Prague, included sage, vinegar, and dried rose petals soaked in wine. Some drank it. Others bathed in it before sex, convinced it would cleanse the body's heat. Did it work? Probably not, but it smelled better than most things at the time. And what of the aftermath? After the dead were burned, buried, forgotten, people had to decide how to live again. Some clung harder to the old rules. Churches rebuilt. Morality pamphlets flooded cities. Sumptuary laws were enforced with new vigor. Don't wear red. Don't show your ankles. Don't dance. Definitely don't kiss in public. Others refused to go back. They'd seen too much, lost too much. They'd learned that love, or lust, wasn't always a sin. Sometimes it was a lifeline. And maybe that's what scared the church most. That even in the worst of times, people still reached for each other. Not because they were wicked, but because they were alive. The ink is smudged. Someone's hand trembled while writing. Or maybe they cried. Maybe they ran out of light. Either way, the letter is crooked, desperate, and damp at the corners, folded again and again until the parchment cracked at the edges. It's not a royal decree or a saint's confession. It's a love letter from prison. And it tells you something no sermon ever could. Even in chains, people still loved. Because in the medieval world, where love was confined by caste and controlled by clergy, those who loved wrong were punished hardest and spoke the truest. Let's unroll this scroll of heartbreak. Medieval prisons weren't stone castles with neat rows of cells. They were dungeons, cisterns, sometimes just a locked room in a basement. No plumbing, no beds, no privacy, and no assumption that you'd ever get out. So when someone wrote from inside, it meant they had something to say before the silence came. We begin with a scribe named Gilles, arrested in 1381 for writing obscene verses about a knight's wife. He claimed it was fiction. The knight disagreed. Gilles was beaten, imprisoned, and left with ink and a small scrap of parchment. What did he write? They took my tongue, but left me my hands. So I speak to you with scratches and fold my love into corners. Historians found the scrap beneath a floorboard in the prison chapel. No one knows if it ever reached her, but someone, sometime, hid it carefully. Then there's the story of Beatrice, a servant girl in Castile. She fell in love with another maid. Their affection was quiet, until a noblewoman saw them kissing and reported them to the parish priest. Beatrice was jailed for impure conduct and questioned. The other girl was married off swiftly to a distant cousin in Toledo. Beatrice never saw her again. She wrote 6 letters. Only 2 survive. One reads, "They say I am unclean, but your hand was the only prayer I ever believed." The church never replied, but not all lovers were silent. In Paris in 1402, a man named Jacques was imprisoned for fraudulent seduction. He had disguised himself as a priest to court a merchant's daughter. She knew. She didn't care. When they were discovered, she was locked in a convent. He was thrown into the Châtelet. There he wrote a 48-line poem to her, begging her not to take her vows. Do not wed the silence. Do not veil the stars. If they chain your mouth, let your eyes speak my name. She did take the veil, but her sister, moved by the letter, copied the poem and had it etched into the wooden door of her family's barn, in tiny script, almost invisible. Centuries later, a scholar found it during a restoration and traced the lines back to Jacquet's trial record. Love leaves fingerprints even in exile. And some wrote from the brink of death. A midwife accused of abortion in 1357 wrote a single letter, inked in blood, to the girl she'd helped. She said nothing of innocence or guilt, only this: if they ask you what I did, say I helped you be free. She was burned the next morning. Let's pause here for a fringe fact. In some prisons, scribes were hired, not for legal records, but to write letters for the illiterate. If you had coin, you could whisper your feelings to a man through a hole in the wall, and he'd scratch them into parchment. For love, for goodbye, for forgiveness, and occasionally, for revenge. There's one infamous case of a noblewoman who hired a prison scribe to write a series of erotic letters to her ex-husband, purely to embarrass him. The scribe later published them as satire. The church was furious. The public was delighted. Because even pain has poetry. And these letters weren't just for lovers. Some were written by children to imprisoned mothers, some by monks to brothers they were forbidden to see. Some were prayers disguised as apologies. Some were confessions that admitted everything but regret. They survive in bits, margins, court records, forgotten archives. One particularly haunting example comes from a condemned man in Rouen who wrote simply, "I loved wrongly, but I loved." That is more than most can say. And isn't that the truth? These people weren't saints. They weren't rebels. They were just human. Trapped between sin and silence, between touch and punishment, between a church that feared pleasure and a world that punished emotion. And when everything else was taken, their homes, their names, their lovers, they still found a way to speak. With ink, with blood, with broken Latin, and even more broken hearts. So tonight, you sit by the fire, you hold a page, the candle flickers, and you read the words of someone who lived 600 years ago, but still managed to say exactly what you feel. They called it wicked. I called it real. And I would write it again. She stands alone at the edge of the gallows. Not as a prisoner, not this time, but as the one who waits. People look away when she passes. Some spit, some cross themselves. A few stare too long. She ignores them all. Her eyes are fixed on the man with the rope and the hood, not the executioner. The man standing next to him, the one she loves. Because in a world of rules, ranks, and reverence, some people find love in the shadows, in the places the rest of the world tries to forget. Tonight, you'll meet the unspoken hearts, the executioner's lover, the streetwalker's confidant, the leper's midnight bride, the ones who didn't marry for status, but for survival, or maybe impossibly, for something like tenderness. Let's start with the executioners. In medieval Europe, executioners were necessary but feared. Their job made them social outcasts, unable to live in town, touch bread in the market, or drink from public wells. They were often forced to wear red or black hoods in public, even off duty. Children whispered about them, priests avoided them, but someone still had to marry them. And someone always did. Often it was a widow, or a woman with no dowry, or sometimes a bold soul who saw the man, not the title, because behind the axe was still a human being. Often kind, sometimes lonely, frequently paid very well. One such man, known only as Johann, lived outside Würzburg in the late 1400s. His journals survive. In them, he wrote not just of executions, but of his wife, Lisa, a laundress who brought him food, read him scripture, and whispered jokes to him on mornings before beheadings. In one entry, he writes, "When I doubt myself, she touches my cheek." and the blood comes off a little easier. Their love was quiet, functional, and real. Another fringe detail: executioners were sometimes healers on the side, skilled with knives after all. If your child had a cyst, your goat a limp, you might sneak to the city edge and knock on the hangman's door. And when you did, it was often his wife who answered. Let's turn to another love on the margins: sex workers. We've mentioned them throughout this journey. The brothels, the laws, the plague. But what we haven't touched on is the deep, often invisible intimacies they created. Not every client was cruel. Not every transaction was cold. There are records, sparse but potent, of long-term relationships between prostitutes and clients, especially among traveling merchants and scribes. Some would return year after year to the same woman, bring gifts, share letters, confess fears. One man in Dijon left a portion of his estate to Catherine, seamstress and consoler of my heart, who gave me laughter when the world gave me grief. Historians suspect seamstress was code. The rest, pretty clear. There's also the story of Anne, a woman from Bruges, arrested for wandering after curfew. When asked why, she said, "He walks home late. I meet him. We walk a while, that's all." They didn't live together. They couldn't. He was a merchant's son. She worked the streets, but they walked nightly. For years. There's no record of what happened to them. But someone drew a small heart beside her name in the court register. Maybe the scribe felt something. Maybe he was just tired. Then there were the lepers. Feared, shunned, locked in colonies outside city walls. If you contracted leprosy, you were declared dead to the world in a formal ceremony. Bells were rung. Your name was struck from records. You were given a robe, a clapper, and exile. And yet, people still fell in love in those places. Within leper houses, marriages were sometimes permitted. Not official ones, not blessed by bishops, but human ones, solemnized with touch and trust and whispered vows. One surviving leper house in Scotland records the union of M, the weaver, and T, the washerwoman, married in the eyes of their fellows. They shared a small hut, grew herbs, played dice. They weren't cured, but they were together. There's also the account of a woman who snuck into a leper colony once a week to see her husband. She wore gloves, wrapped herself in vinegar-soaked cloth, left before dawn. They met under the chapel roof, talked, prayed, held hands, gloved, trembling. When she was discovered, she was excommunicated. Her final statement? "If love is a sin, then may I be judged kindly for it." So what do all these stories tell you? They tell you that not all love wore white. Not all love stood before altars or smiled from tapestries. Some love stood barefoot in mud, or sat beside a noose, or whispered through iron bars. Some love waited in silence, endured insult, gave up comfort, and asked for nothing but presence. And maybe, just maybe, that kind of love was the purest of all. Because it wasn't about glory or approval. It was about choosing someone the world refused to choose. And holding on. Even when the rope tightened. Even when the judge scowled. Even when all that remained was a name scratched into the wall by a trembling hand. So next time you hear the bells toll, don't assume they ring only for saints or sinners. Sometimes they ring for lovers the world tried to forget. There's a whisper in your town square. Not a voice exactly, more like a ripple, an unease that moves through the baker's stall, over the churchyard, between the market carts. It clings to gossip and sermons, slips into the schoolyard, lingers in the pause between someone saying, "good girl," and meaning, "good wife." You don't always notice it, but it notices you. It's the echo of something old. Because long after the last torch burned out, and the last shame-laced sermon faded, the medieval obsession with purity, sin, and sexuality never really left. It just put on different clothes. Tonight, you're not in a castle, or a cloister. You're scrolling on your phone, walking down a clean modern street. Maybe you're sipping a latte. Maybe you're falling asleep. But look closer. You're still living in the afterglow of 1,000 medieval moans and miseries. Let's unpack that. Start with the concept of purity culture, the idea that a person's value is tied to their sexual cleanliness. Sounds familiar, right? Medieval people lived under this pressure constantly. Virginity wasn't just prized. It was monetized, weaponized, criminalized. Whether you were a peasant girl or a noble bride, your body was a political object, a theological map, a walking contract. Fast forward 600 years, and the language may have shifted, but the anxiety remains. The judgment, the shame, the way we treat desire as something to fear, to hide, to punish, especially in women. Even phrases like saving yourself or damaged goods have roots in medieval legal language, as if human connection can be spoiled like wine in the sun. And what about the double standard? Back then, men were allowed to confess and move on. Women, especially poor ones, were punished, publicly, permanently, sometimes violently. Sound eerily familiar? Modern systems still mirror that imbalance. Different rules for different genders. A boy sows wild oats. A girl ruins her reputation. One gets a wink. The other gets ostracized. Or worse. And let's not forget how society still fears queer love. The same whispered panic from the monastery dormitory now shows up in political debates, banned books, and bathroom bills. The old unnatural accusations, once hurled in courtrooms lit by candlelight, now glow behind headlines and hashtags. It's not new. It's just louder, more digital, less goat Sabbath, more moral panic on morning television. Even our fascination with scandal, it's medieval. Back then, people crowded into public trials to hear the juicy sins of others. They cheered for executions. They scrawled erotic graffiti in bathhouses. They passed notes between confessionals. Today, it's tabloid articles, viral leaks, shame scrolls through comment sections. Still that same twitch in the soul that wants to watch someone fall from grace. Because it's easier to point fingers than ask yourself, why am I so obsessed with someone else's body? And then there's the silence. The modern shame that keeps people from talking about pleasure, pain, identity. The fear of being too much or not enough. The silence that says, that's not for you to ask about. Same silence that hushed medieval girls before their wedding night. Same silence that closed monastery doors over whispered poetry. Same silence that hanged a woman because she kissed the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong century. But, and this matters, not everything was pain. Even in the medieval world, people found joy. They touched, they loved. They figured things out in their own strange ways. The midwives, the scribes, the lovers, the rebels, the ones who dared to speak, to write, to act. They left traces for us. And maybe the best way to honor them is to break the silence, to say, I know where this fear came from, and I don't have to carry it anymore. You are not living in the 1300s. But the ideas? They're still stitched into your clothes. In the dress code, the classroom, the awkward glance when you speak too boldly. Still hiding behind every, you should be ashamed. But you don't have to listen, because you've heard the full story now. And it's not just about sex. It's about control, narratives, power, and what happens when people, quietly, bravely, begin to reclaim their fire. So as the candle dies down and your breath settles, think of this. Somewhere, a girl once tore a page out of a holy book and wrote a love poem in the margin. Somewhere a boy kissed a scribe beneath a vaulted ceiling, both trembling. Somewhere a widow climbed the gallows steps, not to die, but to hold the hand of the man everyone feared. And now, centuries later, you know their names aren't on monuments. But their stories? They burn in the dark, still. The fire is low now. Its light flickers softly across the room, not the harsh blaze of questions or shame, but the quiet warmth of understanding. The stories have been told, the candles burned through, the ghosts of the past, the witches, the scribes, the midwives, the lovers, have all taken their bow. And now it's just you and the soft silence that follows. You don't need to remember every name, every law, every strange ritual whispered under breath in a cloister or alley. You don't need to catalog every injustice or carry every heartbreak. What matters is this: you were there, you listened, you let the past breathe. So many of the people we met tonight were never allowed that. They lived in the space between pages, between punishments and prayers. They survived in margins, in rumors, in kisses never confessed aloud, and still somehow they found ways to love. Through danger, through silence, through centuries of rules written by trembling hands. And maybe now that their words have reached you, something in your own world feels a little clearer, softer. You start to notice the way history still hums beneath the modern noise. How old rules echo in new ones. How shame still knocks, wearing a different coat. How freedom sometimes looks like a girl standing barefoot in a field, whispering her truth to no one in particular. Tonight, you've wandered through alleys no guidebook shows. You've sat beside executioners, climbed into brothel beds, read letters from prison, watched a mother kiss her child goodbye at the edge of a plague pit. Not because you wanted drama, but because you wanted truth. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. That's what real sleep stories are, isn't it? Not fairy tales, but stories that remember us. That hold up a mirror. Crooked maybe, but honest. That say, you're not the first to feel like this. You are not alone. The world told people to be silent. They whispered anyway. The world told people to be ashamed. They touched anyway. The world told people to fear love. They loved anyway. And now, it's your turn to rest. So lie back. Let the past dim behind your eyes like a closing curtain. Let the weight of centuries slip from your shoulders. You don't have to carry it tonight. The midwife has gone home. The scribe's candle has burned low. The gallows are empty. The plague has passed. The devil's hooves have faded into folklore. And the chains, real and imagined, have rusted. All that's left is breath. Yours. Gentle. Safe. Still. And maybe, just maybe, free.